Britain didn't have air raid sirens yet, but it already feared the sound they'd one day make. By 1934, a nightmare haunted military planners. German bombers streaking across the Channel, reaching London in minutes. Too fast to stop, too deadly to ignore. The math was merciless. At 200 miles an hour, a bomber could cross the narrow sea in 20 minutes. Spotters on the coast might see them with 10 minutes to spare, if the weather cooperated. Fog, cloud, or nightfall turned Britain blind. By the time a phone message reached command and fighters took off, the bombs would already be falling. Former Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had said it bluntly before Parliament: the bomber will always get through. It wasn't defeatism, it was arithmetic. Britain's defenses were primitive. Observation posts could only see what was already overhead. Along the Kent coast, massive concrete, sound mirrors, alien-looking dishes meant to catch the hum of enemy engines, stood like monuments to wishful thinking. They detected where a plane had been, not where it was. Trying to defend the island by listening for echoes was hopeless. The Air Ministry needed a miracle. So that autumn, they formed a secret think tank, the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, led by Henry Tizard of Imperial College. Their mission: explore anything that might stop a bomber, no matter how crazy it sounded. The first idea came from retired Air Marshal Hugh Dowding. Could radio waves become a death ray? It seemed wild but not impossible. Radio carried energy, enough, perhaps, to burn an aircraft's engine or crew. The committee turned to Robert WWII, a Scottish engineer who studied how radio waves bounced through the upper atmosphere. WWII handed the calculations to his assistant, Arnold Wilkins, who soon returned with bad news and a revelation. No transmitter on Earth could generate a lethal beam powerful enough to fry a bomber midair. But as he crunched the numbers, Wilkins realized something stunning. Radio waves would bounce off metal aircraft and send back an echo. WWII saw it instantly. The solution wasn't to destroy bombers with radio, it was to see them with it. On February 12, 1935, he sent the Air Ministry a 4-page report titled Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods. It was short, technical, and revolutionary. He proposed sending bursts of radio energy into the sky and timing their reflections. The delay would reveal the aircraft's distance, with the precision of light itself. Britain hadn't yet built a death ray. But it had just discovered something far more powerful. Britain hadn't built a death ray, but it had just learned how to see the enemy before he struck. The discovery came at the perfect moment. The Air Ministry was desperate, politicians impatient, and WWII's idea had one priceless advantage: it could be tested immediately. No fantasy weapons, no years of development. Just radio waves, math, and nerve. Within 2 weeks of his secret memorandum, the Air Ministry ordered a live demonstration. The clock was already ticking. Skeptics in London were ready to pull the plug if the radio vision theory failed to deliver proof. WWII set the date: February 26, 1935. Location: a muddy field near Daventry, Northamptonshire, chosen for one simple reason: the BBC had a powerful shortwave transmitter nearby. He would borrow its signal to bounce off an aircraft. The setup looked laughably primitive. A single Morris van packed with a receiver and an oscilloscope, just 2 men and a flickering green line. Overhead, an RAF Hayford bomber flew back and forth through the invisible radio beam. Then it happened. A pulse on the screen, sharp and undeniable. Each time the aircraft crossed the beam, the trace jumped. The echo was real. In one morning, with borrowed gear and British mud clinging to their boots, WWII and Arnold Wilkins proved that radio could see beyond sight. The reaction in London was instant. Funding poured in. A proper research site was established at Orfordness on England's east coast. By summer 1935, their crude test had evolved into powerful transmitters and sensitive receivers built from scratch. They weren't stealing BBC signals anymore. They were forging the world's first eyes in the dark. The team solved impossible problems at breakneck speed, generating short, powerful radio bursts, switching instantly to receive faint echoes 1,000,000 times weaker, and learning to measure height, distance, and direction all at once. Every week brought new breakthroughs. By the end of 1935, they were detecting aircraft 40 miles away. By spring 1936 to 75 miles. What called it RDF, radio direction finding, a dull name meant to mislead German spies. Americans would later give it the name history remembers, radar. For Britain, the implications were staggering. Radar could see through fog, night, and cloud. It could spot enemy bombers leaving their airfields across the Channel, 20 minutes before they reached British soil. Fighters could be climbing to intercept while the bombers were still over France. The impossible equation of air defense had been rewritten. Within months, the government authorized full deployment. Radar was no longer a lab experiment. It was the nation's most urgent project. Towers would rise along the coastline, stretching from Southampton to Newcastle, their steel frames nearly 350 feet high. Miles of cable, thousands of workers, a race against time. Because everyone knew the question wasn't if Germany would come, only when. Britain's coastlines soon bristled with steel. The invisible fence, what had promised in 1935 was no longer theory, it was rising skyward. Radar waves, like light, traveled straight. They couldn't bend over the Earth's curve. So engineers built tall towers, 350 feet high, to stretch Britain's vision beyond the horizon. At that height, radar could spot enemy bombers at nearly 120 miles, giving precious minutes of warning before the first sirens wailed. Each chain home station was a small city of wires and steel, 4 massive transmitting towers in a row, for shorter wooden receivers beside them, their latticed frames strung with copper like webs of lightning. The wooden towers were used because metal interfered with the faint returning echoes. From afar, the sights looked impossible to hide, so the British didn't try. They hid the truth in plain sight. By 1937, the first stations were active. A year later, during the Munich crisis, there were 18, stretching from Portsmouth to Scotland, feeding real-time data to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory. Radar operators tracked blips on glowing cathode ray screens, plotters marked maps, and controllers relayed coordinates to Spitfire squadrons within minutes. The world's first integrated air defense system was taking shape. Operating it required skill and secrecy. About 70 men and women ran each station around the clock, deciphering faint pulses from the sky and separating enemy aircraft from static, weather, and the sea. Training schools turned young recruits into experts who could read invisible signals like second sight. The system wasn't perfect. It could easily spot high-altitude bombers, but struggled with low-flying aircraft and altitude accuracy. To close that gap, engineers built Chain Home Low, a second radar network tuned to shorter wavelengths that could catch raiders slipping beneath the main beams. The cost was staggering, over £1 million, roughly $70 million today, and Parliament demanded to know what the money was buying. But the project was classified. Officials claimed the towers were radio research stations studying atmospheric conditions. Technically true. Brilliantly misleading. Even German reconnaissance photographed the towers. Their analysts noted them, but dismissed them as communication masts. It would be one of history's most important intelligence failures. By September 3, 1939, when Britain declared war, 21 stations formed an unbroken electronic shield across the coast. Radar could track enemy aircraft forming up over Germany and follow them across the Channel in real time. Fighter Command now knew where bombers were coming from, how many, and how high. Britain finally held the advantage, but it depended entirely on silence. If Germany learned the truth, they'd strike the radar towers first. So secrecy became obsession. The word radar was banned. Internally, it was called RDF, radio direction finding, a name so dull it discouraged curiosity. Personnel signed the Official Secrets Act, barred from discussing their work or even telling families what they did. Many operators were WAFs, women serving in isolated outposts, reading green pulses through sleepless nights. They could literally watch bomber formations rise from France, cross the sea, and vanish over British cities, without ever being allowed to say how. German reconnaissance kept photographing the towers. To confuse them, British counterintelligence built dummy masts, moved real equipment, and leaked rumors about death ray experiments. Let Berlin chase ghosts while the real miracle stayed hidden. When the bombing began, Chain Home proved its worth. German formations appeared on radar long before they reached British soil. Fighters were already waiting in the right sky at the right altitude. From the Luftwaffe's view, it seemed impossible, almost supernatural. And that's when the perfect cover story was born. British propaganda officials, struggling to promote vegetable consumption during rationing, noticed reports about a night fighter ace, John Cunningham, who kept shooting down German bombers in darkness. His secret was airborne radar, but that, of course, couldn't be told. So the Ministry of Information invented a simpler truth. British pilots could see in the dark because they ate carrots. The claim was absurd and brilliant. It explained everything the enemy couldn't understand, sounded scientifically plausible, and encouraged civilians to eat their vegetables. The Germans believed it. The public repeated it. And radar, Britain's real secret weapon, remained hidden behind the glow of a humble carrot. By 1940, Britain's radar network could see the enemy long before he arrived, but no one outside the War Office could know why. The public needed an explanation for the RAF's uncanny success in the dark. That explanation would come not from a laboratory, but from a vegetable. Carrots contained vitamin A, a nutrient genuinely vital for night vision. The Ministry of Information saw potential in that tiny truth. If British pilots were downing bombers in total darkness, perhaps. So the story went, it was because they ate a lot of carrots. The timing was perfect. Wartime rationing had turned Britain into a land of surplus root vegetables. Warehouses overflowed with carrots no one wanted, while imported fruit had vanished. The Ministry of Food needed to make carrots glamorous, and now, patriotic. Posters soon filled the streets. Dr. Carrot, the children's best friend. Cartoon vegetables smiled from kitchen walls. Recipe booklets promised carrot jam, carrot fudge, even carrot pudding. But none of it worked until the Air Ministry lent the story its heroism. When RAF night fighters began bringing down German bombers under moonless skies, the government quietly linked the two. Press releases claimed pilots' extraordinary eyesight came from a carrot-rich diet. Radio shows, newspapers, and cartoons all repeated the message. Cheerful, confident, and just plausible enough to sound true. The science wasn't entirely fake. Vitamin A really did prevent night blindness. What the propaganda did was stretch that fact into fantasy, turning prevents blindness into sees through darkness. And the brilliance lay in the restraint. The British didn't shout the claim, they let others connect the dots. Civilians ate more carrots, believing they were helping the war effort. German intelligence, intercepting British news, noted the reports and took them seriously. If RAF pilots were seeing bombers before radar should have allowed it, perhaps the secret was biological, not electronic. The myth needed a face, and the ministry found one. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham. Young, composed, and undeniably successful, Cunningham became the perfect embodiment of the legend. In truth, his victories came from an early airborne radar, a miniaturized version of Chain Home installed in his Bristol Beaufighter. Guided by his radar operator, he hunted bombers by echo rather than eyesight. But to the public, he was the man who could see in the dark. Newspapers told of his carrot-heavy diet and natural night vision. Posters showed him squinting heroically at the stars. In interviews, Cunningham played along, careful, patriotic, never lying outright, simply omitting what he couldn't say. To civilians, he was proof that nutrition and courage could defend the nation. To German analysts, he was evidence of some mysterious British advantage. To history, he became the charming disguise that protected radar, the secret weapon hidden behind a vegetable garden. But the myth didn't end with John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, it only grew stronger. To the public, he was the man who could see in the dark. To German intelligence, he was living proof that the British had found some biological edge. In truth, his brilliance came not from carrots but from radar, and his ability to work flawlessly with his operator, reading faint green blips and turning them into kills. Each interception demanded perfect teamwork, steady nerves, and absolute trust in the new technology. Yet the propaganda machine needed a symbol, not a technician. Cunningham's photogenic calm and catchy nickname fit perfectly. Other night fighter aces like Brant's Burbridge, who eventually surpassed his score, were quietly ignored. The story wasn't about equality, it was about control. Britain needed one hero to carry the myth that explained its success without revealing the real cause. German analysts followed these stories closely. Luftwaffe intelligence reports noted repeated references to pilots' exceptional eyesight and dietary advantages. Some even speculated about optical training or special supplements. A few mentioned carrots directly. The deception was working. Serious minds were spending serious time chasing the wrong idea. The irony was sharp. Cunningham's true skill, mastering primitive radar under impossible conditions, was more impressive than the legend ever claimed. But propaganda prefers clarity over complexity, and cat's eyes fit on a poster. German intelligence, meanwhile, wasn't blind or incompetent. They had their own radar systems, Freya for early warning and Würzburg for precision tracking, and they understood the science perfectly well. Their aircraft had photographed the tall British towers of Chainholm as early as 1939. Analysts correctly suspected they were radar installations, but they misjudged their capability. German engineers assumed the height of the towers meant Britain was using long, outdated wavelengths, less precise than Germany's own shorter-range systems. Technically, they were right about the wavelength but disastrously wrong about the effect. Chainholm's long waves gave it immense reach and resilience in bad weather. What German scientists dismissed as crude was, in practice, smarter. That arrogance became an intelligence blind spot. Convinced British radar was primitive, German analysts interpreted RAF night victories through other lenses, training, luck, or vision. The carrot myth offered a tidy explanation, so they embraced it. And it wasn't entirely absurd. German medical research from the First World War had already linked vitamin A deficiency to night blindness. Nutrition studies were taken seriously in the Wehrmacht. So when British broadcasts praised carrots for improving vision, the idea sounded plausible, even scientific. At the same time, Britain's success truly was multifactorial. Well-trained pilots, specialized aircraft, and expert ground control all contributed. That complexity made radar's role harder to isolate, especially when the enemy wanted to believe a simpler story. Confirmation bias did the rest. Once the carrot theory took hold, German analysts unconsciously filtered new information to fit it. Radar towers were reclassified as experimental, bomber reports of unseen fighters were attributed to superior eyesight. The deception had become self-sustaining. Inside Germany's intelligence community, fragmentation deepened the confusion. The Luftwaffe's analysts, the Abwehr, and separate research institutes all gathered data, but rarely compared notes. Information was abundant, but synthesis was missing. Britain's greatest secret stayed hidden, not only behind propaganda posters but behind German assumptions. A lie need not be shouted to be believed. Sometimes, it only needs to sound reasonable and arrive at exactly the moment your enemy wants it to be true. The fragmentation within German intelligence only deepened the deception's success. One branch might correctly identify radar as vital to Britain's defense, while another chased theories about diet and supplements, and neither compared findings. That dysfunction magnified the effect of British misinformation. More importantly, Germany's military leadership didn't want to believe Britain had achieved technological superiority. To admit that radar had tilted the balance meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that German science, once the envy of Europe, had fallen behind. It was far easier to blame tactics, training, or even nutrition than to accept a systemic disadvantage. Intelligence reports often told commanders what they wished to hear, not what they needed to know. When the Battle of Britain ended in Germany's defeat, the consequences of that denial became clear. Radar had quietly determined the outcome. Every major German raid was tracked the moment it left the French coast. Fighter command could launch interceptors at the right time, from the right airfields, at the right altitude. The system had flaws. Low-flying aircraft sometimes slipped through, but it turned chaos into calculation. The RAF's few fought with precision because radar told them where to look, not because they'd eaten their vegetables. Meanwhile, the carrot myth refused to die. Even after the war, When radar's existence was publicly acknowledged, the story lingered in homes and classrooms. Parents urged children to eat carrots for better eyesight, unaware they were echoing a 1940s deception. The lie endured because it was simple, charming, and empowering, far easier to believe than an explanation about radio waves and oscilloscopes. Watson received a knighthood in 1942 for services that remained classified for years. Only after the war did his role emerge fully, revealing how radar had joined code-breaking at Bletchley Park and nuclear research as one of the true turning points of the conflict. Churchill himself later admitted that the few would have fought blind without the system Watson conceived in that muddy Daventry field. Captured German intelligence files after 1945 confirmed how completely the deception had worked. Reports described British night fighter success as a result of superior training, aircraft design, and possibly dietary enhancement. Radar was mentioned, but often dismissed as crude or limited. The Germans hadn't failed to see British radar, they'd failed to understand it. From those wartime towers grew a technology that reshaped the modern world. Post-war radar evolved into air traffic control, weather forecasting, maritime navigation, and even microwave cooking. The same magnetrons that once pulsed against bombers now heat dinners in kitchen ovens. Historians today teach the Carrot Campaign as a masterclass in strategic deception, a perfect blend of truth and misdirection. Vitamin A truly supports vision, carrots truly contain it, British pilots truly succeeded. But the connection between carrots and victory was a fabrication so elegant that it outlived its purpose. The most convincing lies are those built from real parts of the truth. Even 80 years later, the myth persists, retold in classrooms, health articles, and bedtime stories. Nutritionists correct it endlessly, yet facts rarely defeat a story that makes people feel good. In that sense, the propaganda achieved a kind of immortality. Britain's wartime experience proved that information, when properly concealed, can outweigh firepower. Radar, hidden behind a myth about eyesight, became the invisible shield that preserved a nation. And though the steel towers of Chainholm have mostly vanished, a few still stand on the coast, silent witnesses to the moment when science, secrecy, and storytelling together saved Britain, protected, quite literally, by a lie about carrots.